After spending 15 years on death row, Betty Lou Beets was executed in Texas. But to understand how a great-grandmother in her 60s ended up on death row, we have to go back to a summer evening in 1983 and a man who never came home from a fishing trip. Jimmy Don Beets was Betty's fifth husband, her sixth if you count the man she married twice, but Jimmy would be the last. On the evening of August 6, 1983, at their modest home near Cedar Creek Lake, Betty sat inside with Jimmy and her son, Robbie. The house was tucked away, quiet and isolated. At some point during the evening, she pulled Robbie aside and told him she was done with the marriage, done with Jimmy, that she couldn't do it anymore. And then she told him something else, something darker. She said Jimmy had to die, tonight. Then she told him to leave. No explanation, she just told him to go. And he did. He stepped outside, closed the door, and didn't look back. Inside, Jimmy was half asleep in his recliner. The TV flickered in the corner, casting soft flashes of light across the room. He didn't hear Betty walk in, didn't see the pistol in her hand. There was no yelling, no struggle. She just raised it, fired 2 shots, and both hit him in the head. He was gone before he could even react. Jimmy's body sagged into the cushions as life left him. Betty stood there for a moment, just watching. She didn't check for a pulse, didn't cry. She just stared at him, then turned and walked away. When Robbie came back 2 hours later, he didn't ask questions, and Betty didn't have to say a word. She just stood there, calm in a way that didn't make sense. Jimmy still lay slumped and lifeless, exactly where she had left him. Robbie looked at her, then at the body, and back again. There was no panic, no tears, just a quiet certainty, like she had already rehearsed this moment out in her head 100 times. She didn't explain, and he didn't press her. All she said was, "Help me get rid of the body." And he did. Out in the yard, the old wishing well waited. It wasn't real, just a decorative pit made of bricks. Jimmy and Robbie had built it that summer, sweating through the Texas heat, never imagining it would be used for anything but yard art. Together, they lowered Jimmy into it, careful, quiet. They wrapped him in layers, sealed the bricks, and poured concrete over the top. When they finished, the well looked untouched, like nothing had changed. But under that perfect surface, Jimmy was buried, hidden in plain sight. But how would they explain his disappearance? By morning, Betty had figured it out. Down at the harbor, she crushed Jimmy Don's heart medication and scattered the powder across the deck of his fishing boat. Robbie followed behind her, removing the propeller to make it look like a mechanical failure. Then he pushed the boat off the dock and let it drift out into the lake. After that, they went home and waited. Later that night, August 7, 1983, Lil Smith was working at the Redwood Beach Marina on Cedar Creek Lake, tucked between the small towns of Gun Barrel City and 7 Points. It was just after 10 p.m. when a few regulars noticed something bobbing out in the dark. It appeared to be a boat, upside down. 2 men took off in a small vessel and brought the boat back to shore. Inside, they found a fishing license, and the name printed on it, Jimmy Don Beets. Lil didn't wait. She called the Coast Guard first, then Parks and Wildlife, anyone who would listen. Officers started showing up within minutes, but something still nagged at her, so she pulled out the phone book and flipped to the B's. There it was, Jimmy Don Beets, and she dialed the number. No answer. She tried again. Nothing. On the 3rd call, someone finally picked up. A woman's voice. It was Betty. Lil told her what they had found, that Jimmy's boat was drifting near the marina and his fishing license had been recovered on board. Betty didn't panic. She didn't cry. She calmly drove down to the marina and confirmed what everybody feared. The boat was Jimmy's. But where was he? By that time, the wind had kicked up and the lake was rough, so the officers decided to hold off until morning to start the full search. By 8:30 the next day, police knocked on Betty's door. They asked her if Jimmy came home overnight. and Betty told them no. He had gone fishing the evening before and never returned. But this time, she added something else. Jimmy had been having problems with the boat, and with that information, the search kicked into high gear. Rescue crews from across the state joined in. Local fire departments, the Henderson County Sheriff's Office, even firefighters from Dallas, where Jimmy had worked for 26 years. They had all gathered to find their friend, and for 3 weeks they dragged the lake. They used boats, divers, and even helicopters, but they found nothing. Jimmy Don Beets had disappeared. At least that's how it seemed. As the search dragged on, Betty kept her distance. She didn't come around much during the search and kept to herself. But one man did check in on her more than once, Denny Burris, the fire department chaplain. He had known Jimmy for years. But every time he visited, Betty barely mentioned the lake or the cruise or the hope that Jimmy might be found. Instead, she asked questions, very specific ones. She wanted to know if Jimmy had life insurance through the city and if she would qualify for his pension. Not once did she ask if they had found his boots or if divers were still out there. This didn't sit right with Denny, so he looked into it. Turns out Jimmy had around $110,000 in life insurance, and Betty would be eligible for $1,200 a month in pension. But there was a catch. Without a body, there would be a 7-year waiting period before any of it could be paid out. So for a while, that was the end of it. But nearly 2 years later, in the spring of 1985, something changed. A tip came into the Henderson County Sheriff's Office, quiet, anonymous, and too specific to ignore. It hinted that Jimmy's death wasn't accidental at all and that Betty might be hiding more than grief. Investigators started digging into her past, and on June 8th, deputies arrested her, then got a warrant to search the house she once shared with Jimmy. And what they found there stunned even the most seasoned officers. In the front yard, under a concrete-covered wishing well, investigators found what they had been looking for: human remains. Someone had been shot twice in the head and buried just steps from the front door. It was Jimmy. But that wasn't all. Behind the house, under a shed, investigators found another body, badly decomposed, hidden deep in the soil. It was Doyle Wayne Barker, Betty's 4th husband. And just like Jimmy, he had been shot with a .38 round and was buried like trash behind the home he once paid for. The .38 caliber collector's pistol they had already taken from Betty's house 2 years ago matched both killings. But how did 2 men end up dead in her yard? Investigators started looking into her past, and what they found wasn't just troubling, it was a pattern. Betty lost most of her hearing as a child after a bout with measles, or at least that's what doctors said. But years later, she claimed the real damage came from her father, alleging physical and sexual abuse that was never documented in court until after her conviction. When Betty was 12, her mother was committed to a psychiatric hospital, and Betty took over raising her younger siblings. Her childhood ended early, and her adult life quickly unfolded in a string of broken marriages and police reports. She married for the first time at just 15 years old. Her husband, Robert Branson, fathered 6 of her children. For the next 17 years, they got entangled in a cycle of breaking up and getting back together, until they eventually divorced in 1969. Over the years, Betty married 6 men in total, one of them twice. She later called most of those relationships abusive, but those accusations only came long after police had pulled 2 bodies from her yard. Her second husband, Bill Lane, was shot by Betty on 2 separate occasions, once in the abdomen and once in the back. He survived both times and even testified that he had threatened to kill her first. Betty never faced charges, and in a twist that underscored the chaos of her personal life, she remarried Bill not long after the shooting, only to divorce him again within weeks. Her rap sheet kept growing with public lewdness, firearms charges, and a reputation for flying off the handle. But even then, Betty wasn't done. In 1978, she tried to run over her third husband, Ronnie Threlcold, with her car. He survived as well, and both he and Bill later testified against her in her final trial. And still, the pattern didn't stop. Betty's fourth husband, Doyle Wayne Barker, vanished in 1981. No missing persons report was ever filed. Betty simply told people that he had left her, and because Doyle had a criminal record and a history of moving around, no one questioned it at the time. Betty continued living in the same house, and Doyle's disappearance didn't raise enough suspicion to trigger an investigation. His body would later be discovered buried near the house, and though Betty was never formally charged in his death, prosecutors used his disappearance to strengthen their case when she stood trial for killing her fifth husband, Jimmy Don Beets. Once both bodies were discovered, it didn't take long for investigators to connect the dots. But Betty's defense tried to shift the blame to her son, Robbie, who had been living in the home with her and Jimmy. Maybe he had done it and she hadn't. But when Robbie took the stand, he shattered that idea. He told the jury that on the night of August 6, 1983, his mother had told him straight out she was going to kill Jimmy. Then she told him to leave, and when he came back, Jimmy was already dead. Robbie said he kept quiet for almost 2 years to protect her, but now he needed to protect himself. He called his mother a very selfish woman. The jury believed him, and on October 11, 1985, they found Betty guilty of murdering Jimmy Don Beets for the insurance money. And 3 days later, she was sentenced to die. But Betty didn't go down without a fight. Her appeals dragged on for 15 years, weaving through court after court. At one point, a judge even tossed the sentence, saying insurance payouts didn't count as remuneration under Texas law, but that didn't stick. The ruling was overturned, and Betty's case kept circling up to the Supreme Court and back down again. But every door eventually closed. By early 2000, there were no chances left. Her time had run out. In the final days before her execution, Betty's daughters made one last plea. Through tears, they appeared before the state parole board clutching photographs, images of a woman bruised, swollen, and broken. They said this was their mother's truth, that every man Betty married had hurt her, that the abuse she suffered had gone unseen for too long. And now, with time running out, they begged the state to spare her life. But that didn't work. On February 24th, Betty was taken to the Huntsville unit. She was given the chance to request a final meal, but she declined. She didn't speak much at all. Her attorney later admitted, "She's very scared. She doesn't want to be strapped down to that gurney all alone." And in the end, that's exactly where she was, silent, arms stretched, waiting for the chemicals to do their job. Jimmy's son, Jamie, sat in the witness room and watched the woman who had killed his father. He said Betty didn't look scared, didn't flinch, just lay there, strapped to the gurney like it was any other day. No regret, no emotion. She really didn't have no expression on her face at all, he said afterwards. But Jamie didn't let his focus stay on her. He turned his mind to his dad. "I seen my dad's face," he said. "I knew that he was smiling, and it was over now." When asked if Betty had any final statement, she stayed silent. No last words, no apologies. But as the drugs entered her system, she offered a small smile to her attorney and pastor. Then came 2 coughs, a sharp gasp, and stillness. At 6:18 p.m., she was pronounced dead. Betty Lou Beets was 62 years old. What do you think? Did she do it? Let us know in the comments.